Alright folks, sorry about that. I was having some technical issues. But it should be up and running now. Let me just make sure this thing isn't giving me trouble. Yes, come on. Okay, it looks like it's showing up everywhere. Except for Mixer, which is doing whatever it's doing. So I'm not worrying about that. I tried. Okay, so last time on Peter Watts's Blindsight. Ah, yes. Sarasti had attacked the main character, Siri. Oh man, I'm not prepared to do different voices today. This is the last stretch. Um, I am going to reread the last little blibbit, the last couple paragraphs, just so people know the great revelation that just occurred. The system weakens, slows. It takes so much longer now to perceive, to assess the input, to mull it over, decide in the manner of cognitive beings. But when the flash flood crosses your path, when the lion leaps at you from the grasses, advanced self-awareness is an unaffordable indulgence. The brainstem does its best. It sees the danger, hijacks the body, reacts 100 times faster than that fat old man sitting in the CEO's office upstairs. But every generation it gets harder to work around this creaking neurological bureaucracy. I wastes energy and processing power, self-obsesses to the point of psychosis. Scramblers have no need of it. Scramblers are more parsimonious. With simpler biochemistries, with smaller brains, deprived of tools, of their ship, even of parts of their own metabolism, they think rings around you. They hide their language in plain sight, even when you know what they're saying. They turn your own cognition against itself. They travel between the stars. This is what intelligence can do, unhampered by self awareness. I is not the working mind, you see. For Amanda Bates to say, I do not exist, would be nonsense. But when the processes beneath say the same thing, they are merely reporting that the parasites have died. They are only saying that they are free. And this is the crux of the uh, one of the key revelations that Sarasti attacking Siri has revealed to Siri. We are not much. So now we get to the new material. And let me just, whoops, put in a little page marker so I know where I am and I have a time frame benchmark. So yeah, again, sorry I was late today. Things happened. If the human brain were so simple that we could understand it, we wouldn't be so simple that we. Oh, shit. If the human brain were so simple that we could understand it, we would be so simple that we couldn't. Emerson M. Pugh. Sarasti, you bloodsucker. My knees pressed against my forehead. I hugged my folded legs as though clinging to a branch over a chasm. You vicious asshole! You foul, sadistic monster! My breath rasped loud and mechanical. It nearly drowned out the blood roaring in my ears. You tore me apart. You made me piss and shit myself, and I cried like some gutted baby, and you stripped me naked, you fucking thing. You nightcrawler. You broke my tools. You took away anything I ever had that let me touch anyone, and you didn't have to, you baby fucker. It wasn't necessary, but you knew that, didn't you? You just wanted to play. I've seen your kind at it before. Cats toying with mice. Catch and release. A taste of freedom and then pouncing again. biting not hard enough to kill, not just yet, before you let them loose again and they're hobbling now, maybe a leg snapped or a gash in the belly, but they're still trying, still running or crawling or dragging themselves as fast as they can until you're on them again and again because it's fun, because it gives you pleasure, you sadistic piece of shit. You send us into the arms of that hellish thing and it plays with us too. And maybe you're even working together because it let me escape just like you do. It let me run back right into your arms. And then you strip me down to some raw, half-brained, defenseless animal. I can't rotate or transform. I can't even talk. And you... It wasn't even personal, was it? You don't even hate me. You were just sick of keeping it all in. Sick of restraining yourself with all this meat. And nobody else could be spared from their jobs. This was my job, wasn't it? Not synthesist, not conduit, not even cannon fodder or decoy duty. I'm just something disposable to sharpen your claws on. It hurt. I hurt so much. It hurt just to breathe. I was so alone. Webbing pressed against the curve of my back, bounced me forward gently as a breeze, caught me again. I was back in my tent. My right hand itched. I tried to flex the fingers, but they were embedded in amber. Left hand reached for right and found a plastic carapace extending to the elbow. I opened my eyes. Darkness. Meaningless numbers and a red LED twinkled from somewhere along my forearm. I didn't remember coming here. I didn't remember anyone fixing me. Breaking. Being broken. That is what I remembered. I wanted to die. I wanted to just stay curled up until I withered away. After an age, I forced myself to uncoil. I steadied myself, let some minuscule inertia bump me against the taut, insulated fabric of my tent. I waited for my breathing to steady. It seemed to take hours. I called consensus to the wall, and a feed from the drum. Soft voices, harsh light flaring against the wall, hurting my eyes, peeling them raw. I killed visual and listened to words in the darkness. "A phase?" someone asked. Susan James, her personhood restored. I knew her again. Not a meat sack, no longer a thing. "We have been over this." This was Cunningham. I knew him too. I knew them all. Whatever Sarasti had done to me, however far he'd yanked me from my room, I'd somehow fallen back inside. It should have mattered more. Because for one thing, if it really were so pernicious, natural selection would have weeded it out, James was saying. "You have a naive understanding of evolutionary processes. There's no such thing as survival of the fittest. Survival of the most adequate, maybe. It doesn't matter whether a solution's optimal. All that matters is whether it beats the alternatives." Oh, shit. Wrong voice. Let's try that again. "You have a naive understanding of evolutionary processes. There's no such thing as survival of the fittest. Survival of the most adequate, maybe. It doesn't matter whether a solution's optimal. All that matters is whether it beats the alternatives." I knew that voice, too. It belonged to a demon. "Well, we damn well beat the alternatives." Some subtle overdubbed harmonic in James's voice suggested a chorus, the whole gang rising as one in opposition. I couldn't believe it. I'd just been mutilated, beaten before their eyes, and they were talking about biology? Maybe she's afraid to talk about anything else, I thought. Maybe she's afraid she might be next. Or maybe she just couldn't care less what happens to me. "It's true," Sarasti told her, "that your intellect makes up for your self-awareness to some extent. But you're flightless birds on a remote island. You're not so much successful as isolated from any real competition." No more clipped speech patterns. No more terse phrasing. The transient had made his kill, found his release. Now he didn't care who he knew he was around. "You?" Michelle whispered. "Not we?" We stopped racing long ago, the demon said at last. It's not our fault you don't leave it at that. Ah, Cunningham again. Welcome back. Did you look in on Key? No, Bates said. Satisfied? The demon asked. If you mean the grunts, I'm satisfied you're out of them, Bates said. If you mean... It was completely unwarranted, Yucca. It isn't. You assaulted a crew member. If we had a brig, you'd be in it for the rest of the trip. This isn't a military vessel, Major. You're not in charge. I didn't need a visual feed to know what Bates thought of that. But there was something else in her silence, something that made me bring the drum camera back online. I squinted against the corrosive light, brought down the brightness until all that remained was a faint whisper of pastels. Yes, Bates, stepping off the stairway onto the deck. Grab a chair, Cunningham said from his seat in the Commons. It's golden oldies time. There was something about her. I'm sick of that song, Bates said. We've played it to death. Even now, my tools chipped and battered, my perceptions barely more than baseline, I could see the change. This torture of prisoners, this assault upon crew, had crossed a line in her head. The others wouldn't see it. The lid on her affect was tight as a boilerplate. But even through the dim shadows of my window, the topology glowed around her like neon. Amanda Bates was no longer merely considering a change of command. Now it was only a matter of when. The universe was closed and concentric. My tiny refuge lay in its center. Outside that shell was another, ruled by a monster, patrolled by his lackeys. Beyond that was another still, containing something even more monstrous and incomprehensible, something that might soon devour us all. There was nothing else. Earth was a vague hypothesis, irrelevant to this pocket cosmos. I saw no place into which it might fit. I stayed in the center of the universe for a long time, hiding. I kept the lights off. I didn't eat. I crept from my tent only to piss or shit in the cramped head down at Fab, and only when the spine was deserted. A field of painful blisters rose across my flash-burned back, as densely packed as kernels on a corn cob. The slightest abrasion tore them open. Nobody tapped at my door, nobody called my name through consensus. I wouldn't have answered if they had. Maybe they knew that somehow. Maybe they kept their distance out of respect for my privacy and my disgrace. Maybe they just didn't give a shit. I peeked outside now and then, kept an eye on tactical. I saw Scylla and Charybdis climb into the accretion belt and return, towing captured reaction mass in a great distended mesh between them. I watched our AmpSat reach its destination in the middle of nowhere, saw antimatter's quantum blueprints stream down into Theseus's buffers. Mass and specs combined in Fab, topped up our reserves, forged the tools that Yuka Sarasti needed for his master plan, whatever that was. Maybe he'd lose. Maybe Rorschach would kill us all, but not before it had played with Sarasti the way Sarasti had played with me. That would almost make it worthwhile. Or maybe Bates's mutiny would come first, and succeed. Maybe she would slay the monster, and commandeer the ship, and take us all to safety. But then I remembered. The universe was closed, and so very small. There was really nowhere else to go. I put my ear to feeds throughout the ship. I heard routine instructions from the Predator, murmured conversations among his prey. The prey. I took in only sound, never sight. A video feed would have spilled light into my tent, left me naked and exposed. So I listened in the darkness as the others spoke among themselves. It didn't happen often anymore. Perhaps too much had been said already. Perhaps there was nothing left to do but mind the countdown. Sometimes hours would pass with no more than a cough or a grunt. When they did speak, they never mentioned my name. Only once did I hear any of them even hint at my existence. That was Cunningham talking to Sasha about zombies. I heard them in the galley over breakfast, unusually talkative. Sasha hadn't been let out for a while and was making up for lost time. Cunningham let her, for reasons of his own. Maybe his fears had been soothed somehow. Maybe Sarasti had revealed his master plan. Or maybe Cunningham simply craved distraction from the imminence of the enemy. "It doesn't bug you?" Sasha was saying. "Thinking that your mind, the very thing that makes you you, is nothing but some kind of parasite?"
Forget about minds, he told her. Say you've got a device designed to monitor, cosmic rays, say. What happens when you turn its sensor around so it's not pointing at the sky anymore, but at its own guts?
He answered himself before she could.
It does what it's built to. It measures cosmic rays, even though it's not looking at them anymore. It parses its own circuitry in terms of cosmic ray metaphors because those feel right, because they feel natural, because it can't look at things any other way. But it's the wrong metaphor. So the system misunderstands everything about itself. Maybe that's not a grand and glorious evolutionary leap after all. Maybe it's just a design flaw.
"But you're the biologist. You know Mom was right. Ugh. You know Mom was right better than anyone. Brain's a big glucose hog. Everything it does costs through the nose."
True enough,
Cunningham admitted. "So sentience has got to be good for something, then. Because it's expensive. And if it sucks up energy without doing anything useful, then evolution's going to weed it out just like that."
maybe it did.
He paused long enough to chew food or suck smoke.
Chimpanzees are smarter than orangutans, did you know that? Higher encephalization quotient. Yet they can't always recognize themselves in a mirror. Orangs can.
"So what's your point? Smarter animal, less self-awareness? Chimpanzees are becoming non-sentient?
Or they were before we stopped everything in its tracks.
So why didn't that happen to us?"
What makes you think it didn't?
It was such an obviously stupid question that Sasha didn't have an answer for it. I could imagine her gaping in the silence.
You're not thinking this through, Cunningham said. We're not talking about some kind of zombie lurching around with its arms stretched out, spouting mathematical theorems. A smart automaton would blend in. It would observe those around it, mimic their behavior, act just like everyone else, all the while completely unaware of what it was doing, unaware even of its own existence.
Why would it bother? What would motivate it?
As long as you pull your hand away from an open flame, who cares whether you do it because it hurts or because some feedback algorithm says withdraw if heat flux exceeds critical T? Natural selection doesn't care about motives. If impersonating something increases fitness, then nature will select good impersonators over bad ones. Keep it up long enough and no conscious being would be able to pick your zombie out of a crowd.
Another silence. I could hear him chewing through it.
It'll even be able to participate in a conversation like this one. It could write letters home, impersonate real human feelings, without having the slightest awareness of its own existence.
I don't know, Rob. It just seems...
Oh, it might not be perfect. It might be a bit redundant or resort to the occasional expository info dump. But even real people do that, don't they?
And eventually there aren't any real people left. Just robots pretending to give a shit.
Perhaps. Depends on the population dynamics, among other things. But I'd guess that at least one thing an automaton lacks is empathy. If you can't feel, you can't really relate to something that does, even if you act as though you do. Which makes it interesting to note how many sociopaths show up in the world's upper echelons. How ruthlessness and bottom line self interest are so lauded up in the stratosphere, while anyone showing those traits at ground level gets carted off into detention with the realists. Almost as if society itself is being reshaped from the inside out.
Oh, come on. Society was always pretty... Wait, you're saying the world's corporate elite are non-sentient?
God, no, not nearly. Maybe they're just starting down that road, like chimpanzees.
Yeah, but sociopaths don't blend in well.
Maybe the ones that get diagnosed don't. But by definition, they're the bottom of the class. The others are too smart to get caught, and real automatons would do even better. Besides, when you get powerful enough, you don't need to act like other people. Other people start acting like you.
Sasha whistled. Wow, perfect play actor.
Or not so perfect. Sound like anyone we know?
They may have been talking about someone else entirely, I suppose, but that was as close to a direct reference to Siri Keaton that I heard in all my hours on the grapevine. Nobody else mentioned me, even in passing. That was statistically unlikely, given what I'd just endured in front of them all. Someone should have said something. Perhaps Sarasti had ordered them not to discuss it. I didn't know why, but it was obvious by now that the vampire had been orchestrating their interactions with me for some time. Now I was in hiding, but he knew I'd listen in at some point. Maybe, for some reason, he didn't want my surveillance contaminated. He could have simply locked me out of consensus. He hadn't, which meant he still wanted me in the loop. Zombies. Automatons. Fucking sentience. For once in your goddamn life, understand something. He'd said that to me, or something had, during the assault. Understand that your life depends on it. Almost as if he were doing me a favor. Then he'd left me alone, and had evidently told the others to do the same. Are you listening, Keaton? And he hadn't locked me out of consensus. Centuries of navel-gazing. Millennia of masturbation. Plato to Descartes to Dawkins to Rhonda. Souls and zombie agents and qualia. Kolmogorov of complexity. Consciousness as divine spark. Consciousness as electromagnetic field. Consciousness as functional cluster. I explored it all. Wegner thought it was an executive summary. Penrose heard it in the singing of caged electrons. Noratranders said it was a fraud. Kazim called it leakage from a parallel universe. Metzinger wouldn't even admit it existed. The AIs claimed to have worked it out, then announced they couldn't explain it to us. Gödel was right after all. No system can fully understand itself. Not even the synthesists had been able to rotate it down. The load-bearing beams just couldn't take the strain. All of them, I began to realize, had missed the point. All those theories, all those drug dreams and experiments and models trying to prove what consciousness was, none to explain what it was good for. None needed. Obviously, consciousness makes us what we are. It lets us see the beautiful, the beauty, and the ugliness. It elevates us into the exalted realm of the spiritual. Oh, a few outsiders, Dawkins, Keogh, the occasional writer of hackwork fiction who barely achieved obscurity, wondered briefly at the why of it. Why not soft computers, and no more? Why should non-sentient systems be inherently inferior? But they never really raised their voices above the crowd. The value of what we are was too trivially self-evident to ever call into serious question. Yet the questions persisted, in the minds of the laureates, in the angst of every horny 15-year-old on the planet. Am I nothing but sparking chemistry? Am I a magnet in the ether? I am more than my eyes, my ears, my tongue. I am the little thing behind those things, the thing looking out from inside. But who looks out from its eyes? What does it reduce to? Who am I? Who am I? Who am I? What a fucking stupid question. I could have answered it in a second if Sarasti hadn't forced me to understand it first. Not until we are lost do we begin to understand ourselves. Henry David Thoreau. The shame had scoured me and left me hollow. I didn't care who saw me. I didn't care what state they saw me in. For days I'd floated in my tent, curled into a ball and breathing my own stink while the others made whatever preparations my tormentor had laid out for them. Amanda Bates was the only one who'd raised even a token protest over what Sarasti had done to me. The others kept their eyes down and their mouths shut and did what he told them to, whether from fear or indifference I couldn't tell. It was something else I'd stopped caring about. Sometime during that span, the cast on my arm cracked open like a shucked clam. I upped the lumens long enough to assess its handiwork. My repaired palm itched and glistened in twilight, a longer, deeper fate line running from heel to web. Then back to darkness, and the blind, unconvincing illusion of safety. Sarasti wanted me to believe. Somehow he must have thought that brutalizing and humiliating me would accomplish that. That, broken and drained, I would become an empty vessel to fill as he saw fit. Wasn't it a classic brainwashing technique? To shatter your victim and then glue the pieces back together according to specs of your own choosing? Maybe he was expecting some kind of Stockholm syndrome to set in, or maybe his actions followed some agenda incomprehensible to mere meat. Maybe he'd simply gone insane. He had broken me. He had presented his arguments. I had followed his trail of breadcrumbs through consensus, through Theseus. And now, only 9 days from graduation, I knew one thing for sure. Sarasti was wrong. He had to be. I couldn't see how, but I knew it just the same. He was wrong. Somehow, absurdly, that had become the one thing I did care about. No one in the spine. Only Cunningham visible in biomed, poring over digital dissections, pretending to kill time. I floated above him, my rebuilt hand clinging to the top of the nearest stairwell. It dragged me in a slow, small circle as the drum turned. Even from up there, I could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, a system stuck in a holding pattern, corroding through the long hours as fate advanced with all the time in the world. He looked up. Ah, it lives. I fought the urge to retreat. Just a conversation, for God's sake. It's just two people talking. People do it all the time without your tools. You can do this. You can do this. Just try. So I forced one foot after another down the stairs, weight and apprehension rising in lockstep. I tried to read Cunningham's topology through the haze. Maybe I saw a facade only microns deep. Maybe he would welcome almost any distraction, even if he wouldn't admit it. Or maybe I was just imagining it. "How are you doing?" he asked as I reached the deck. I shrugged. "And all better, I see." "No thanks to you." I'd tried to stop that from coming out. Really. Cunningham struck a cigarette.
"Actually, I was the one who fixed you up."
"You also sat there and watched while he took me apart."
"I wasn't even there."
And then, after a moment,
"But you may be right. I may very well have sat it out in any event. Amanda and the gang did try to intervene on your behalf, from what I hear. Didn't do a lot of good for anyone."
"So you wouldn't even try?"
"Would you, if the situation were reversed? Go up unarmed against a vampire?"
I said nothing. Cunningham regarded me for a long moment, dragging on his cigarette.
"It really got to you, didn't it?"
He said at last. "You're wrong," I said.
"Am I?"
"I don't play people."
Hmm.
He seemed to consider the proposition.
What word would you prefer, then?"
"I observe."
"That you do. Some might even call it surveillance."
I I read body language, hoping that was all he was talking about.
"It's a matter of degree, and you know it. Even in a crowd, there's a certain expectation of privacy. People aren't prepared to have their minds read off every twitch of the eyeball."
He stabbed at the air with his cigarette.
"And you're a shapeshifter. You present a different face to every one of us, and I'll wager none of them is real. The real you, if it even exists, is invisible.
Something knotted below my diaphragm. Who isn't? Who doesn't try to fit in? Who doesn't want to get along? There's nothing malicious about that. I'm a synthesist, for God's sake. I never manipulate the variables.
Well, you see, that's the problem. It's not just variables you're manipulating.
Smoke writhed between us.
But I guess you can't really understand that, can you?
He stood and waved a hand. Consensus windows imploded at his side.
Not your fault, really. You can't blame someone for the way they're wired.
Give me a fucking break, I snarled. That, too, had slipped out before I could stop it. And after that came the flood. You put so much fucking stock in that. You and your empathy. And maybe I am just some kind of imposter, but most people would swear I'd worn their very souls. I don't need that shit. You don't have to feel motives to deduce them. It's better if you can't. It keeps you...
Dispassionate?
Cunningham smiled faintly. Maybe your empathy's just a comforting lie. You ever think of that? Maybe you think you know how the other person feels, but you're only feeling yourself. Maybe you're even worse than me. Or maybe we're all just guessing. Maybe the only difference is that I don't lie to myself about it.
Do they look the way you imagined?
He asked. What? What are you talking about?
The scramblers. Multi-jointed arms from a central mass. Sounds rather similar to me.
He'd been into Spindle's archives. Not really, I said. The arms are more flexible in real life, more segmented, and I never really got a look at the body. What does that have to do with...
Close, though, wasn't it? Same size, same general body plan.
So what?
Why didn't you report it?
I did. Isaac said it was just TMS, from Rorschach.
You saw them before Rorschach. Or at least, he continued, you saw something that scared you into blowing your cover back when you were spying on Isaac and Michelle.
My rage dissipated like air through a breach. They knew?
Only Isaac, I think, and it kept it between it. Oh, Jesus. And it kept it between it and the logs. I suspect it didn't want to interfere with your non-interference protocols. Although I'll wager that was the last time you ever caught the two of them in private, yes?
I didn't say anything.
Did you think the official observer was somehow exempt from observation?
Cunningham asked after a while. No, I said softly. I suppose not.
He nodded. Have you seen any since? I'm not talking about run-of-the-mill TMS hallucinations. I mean scramblers. Have you hallucinated any since you actually saw one in the flesh? Since you knew what they looked like?
I thought about it. No. He shook his head, some new opinion confirmed.
You really are something, Keaton. You know that? You don't lie to yourself. Even now, you don't know what you know.
What are you talking about?
You figured it out. From Rorschach's architecture, probably. Form follows function, yes? Somehow you pieced together a fairly good idea of what a scrambler looked like before anyone ever laid eyes on them. Or at least, he drew a breath, his cigarette flared like an LED. Part of you did. Some collection of unconscious modules working their asses off on your behalf. But they can't show their work, can they? You don't have conscious access to those levels. So one part of the brain tries to tell another any way it can, passes notes under the table.
Blindsight, I murmured. You just get a feeling of where to reach.
More like schizophrenia, except you saw pictures instead of hearing voices. You saw pictures, and you still didn't understand.
I blinked. But how would I... I mean...
What did you think, that Theseus was haunted? That the scramblers were communing with you telepathically? What you do, it matters, Keaton. They told you you were nothing but their stenographer, and they hammered all those layers of hands-off passivity into you, but you just had to take some initiative anyway, didn't you? Had to work the problem on your own. The only thing you couldn't do was admit it to yourself.
Cunningham shook his head.
Siri Keaton, see what they've done to you.
He touched his face.
See what they've done to us all, he whispered.
I found the gang floating in the center of the darkened observation blister. She made room as I joined her, pushed to one side, and anchored herself to a bit of webbing. "Susan?" I asked. I honestly couldn't tell anymore. "I'll get her," Michelle said. "No, that's all right. I'd like to speak to all of—" But Michelle had already fled. The half-lit figure changed before me and said, "She'd rather be alone right now." I nodded. "You?" James shrugged. "I don't mind talking, although I'm surprised you're still doing your reports after—" "I'm not, exactly. This isn't for Earth." I looked around. Not much to see. Faraday mesh coated the inside of the dome like a gray film, dimming and graining the view beyond. Ben hung like a black malignancy across half the sky. I could make out a dozen dim contrails against vague bands of cloud, in reds so deep they bordered on black. The sun winked past James' shoulder. Our sun, a bright dot that diffracted into faint splintered rainbows when I moved my head. That was pretty much it. Starlight didn't penetrate the mesh, nor did the larger, dimmer particles of the accretion belt. The myriad dim pinpoints of shovel-nosed machinery were lost utterly. Which might be a comfort to some, I supposed. "Shitty view," I remarked. Theseus could have projected crisp first-person vistas across the dome in an instant, more real than real. "Michelle likes it," James said, "the way it feels. And Cruncher likes the diffraction effects. He likes interference patterns." We watched nothing for a while, by the dim half-light filtering out from the spine. It brushed the edges of James's profile. "You set me up," I said at last. She looked at me. "What do you mean?" "You were talking around me all along, weren't you? All of you. You didn't bring me in until I'd been, how had she put it? Preconditioned. The whole thing was planned to throw me off balance. And then Sarasti attacks me out of nowhere, and we didn't know about that, not until the alarm went off." "Alarm?" "When he changed the gas mix. You must have heard it. Isn't that why you were there?" "He called me to his tent. He told me to watch." She regarded me from a face full of shadow. "You didn't try to stop him?" I couldn't answer the accusation in her voice. "I just observe," I said weakly. "I thought you were trying to stop him from—" She shook her head. "That's why I thought he was attacking you." "You're saying that that wasn't an act? You weren't in on it?" I didn't believe it. But I could tell she did. "I thought you were trying to protect them." She snorted a soft, humorless laugh at her own mistake and looked away. "I guess I should have known better." She should have. She should have known that taking orders is one thing. Taking sides would have done nothing but compromise my integrity. And I should have been used to it by now. I forged on. It was some kind of object lesson. Uh, a tutorial. You can't torture the non-sentient or something, and I heard you, Susan. It wasn't news to you. It wasn't news to anyone except me, and you hid it from me. You all did. You and your whole gang and Amanda, too. You've been hashing this out for days, and you went out of your way to cover it up. How did I miss it? How did I miss it?" "Yucca told us not to discuss it with you," Susan admitted. "Why? This is exactly the kind of thing I'm out here for. He said you'd resist, unless it was handled properly." "Handled? Susan, he assaulted me. You saw what he—" "We didn't know he was going to do that. None of us did." "And he did it why? To win an argument?" "That's what he says." "Do you believe him?" "Probably." After a moment she shrugged. "Who knows? He's a vampire. He's opaque." "But his record. I mean, he's never resorted to overt violence before. She shook her head. Why should he? He doesn't have to convince the rest of us of anything. We have to follow his orders regardless. So do I reminded her. He's not trying to convince you, Siri. Ah, I was only a conduit after all. Sarasti hadn't been making his case to me at all. He'd been making it through me, and he was planning for a second round. Why go to such extremes to present a case to Earth if Earth was irrelevant? Sarasti didn't expect the game to end out here. He expected Earth to do something in light of his perspective. But what difference does it make? I wondered aloud. She just looked at me. Even if he's right, how does it change anything? How does this, I raised my repaired hand, change anything? Scramblers are intelligent whether they're sentient or not. They're a potential threat either way. We still don't know. So what difference does it make? Why did he do this to me? How does it matter? Susan raised her face to Big Ben and didn't answer. Sasha returned her face to me and tried to. It matters, she said, because it means we attacked them before Theseus launched, before Firefall even. We attacked the... You don't get it, do you? You don't. Sasha snorted softly. That isn't the fucking funniest thing I've heard in my whole short life. She leaned forward, bright-eyed. Imagine you're a scrambler, and you encounter a human signal for the very first time. Her stare was almost predatory. I resisted the urge to back away. It should be so easy for you, Keaton. It should be the easiest gig you've ever had. Aren't you the user interface? Aren't you the Chinese room? Aren't you the one who never has to look inside, never has to walk a mile in anyone's shoes because you figure everyone out from their surfaces? She stared at Ben's dark, smoldering disk. Well, there's your dream date. There's a whole race of nothing but surfaces. There's no inside to figure out. All the rules are right up front. So go to work, Siri Keaton. Make us proud. There was no contempt in Sasha's voice, no disdain. There wasn't even anger, not in her voice, not in her eyes. There was pleading. There were tears. Imagine you're a scrambler, she whispered again, as they floated like tiny, perfect beads before her face. Because of low gravity, don't you know? Imagine you're a scrambler. Imagine you have intellect but no insight, agendas but no awareness. Your circuitry hums with strategies for survival and persistence, flexible, intelligent, even technological, but no other circuitry monitors it. You can think of anything, yet are conscious of nothing. You can't imagine such a being, can you? The term being doesn't even seem to apply in some fundamental way you can't quite put your finger on. Try. Imagine that you encounter a signal. It is structured and dense with information. It meets all the criteria of an intelligent transmission. Evolution and experience offer a variety of paths to follow, branch points in the flowcharts that handle such input. Sometimes these signals come from conspecifics who have useful information to share, whose lives you'll defend according to the rules of kin selection. Sometimes they come from competitors, or predators, or other inimical entities that must be avoided or destroyed. In those cases, the information may prove of significant tactical value. Some signals may even arise from entities that, while not kin, can still serve as allies or symbionts in mutually beneficial pursuits. You can derive appropriate responses for any of these eventualities and many others. You decode the signals and stumble. I had a great time. I really enjoyed him, even if he cost twice as much as any other hooker in the dome. To fully appreciate Kesey's quartet, they hate us for our freedom. Pay attention now. Understand. There are no meaningful translations for these terms. They are needlessly recursive. They contain no usable intelligence, yet they are structured intelligently. There is no chance that they could have arisen by chance. The only explanation is that something has coded nonsense in a way that poses as a useful message. Only after wasting time and effort does the deception become apparent. The signal functions to consume the signal functions to consume the resources of a recipient for zero payoff and reduced fitness. The signal is a virus. Viruses do not arise from kin, symbionts, or other allies. The signal is an attack, and it's coming from right about there. Now you get it, Sasha said. I shook my head, trying to wrap it around that insane, impossible conclusion. They're not even hostile, not even capable of hostility, just so profoundly alien that they couldn't help but treat human language itself as a form of combat. How do you say, "we come in peace," when the very words are an act of war? That's why it won't talk to us, I realized. Only if Yuka's right. He may not be. Oh, shit. Only if Yuka's right. Oh, god damn it, I can't switch. Only if Yuka's right. He may not be. It was James again, still quietly resisting, still unwilling to concede a point that even her other selves had accepted. I could see why. Because if Sarasi was right, scramblers were the norm. Evolution across the universe was nothing but the endless proliferation of automatic, organized complexity, a vast, arid Turing machine full of self-replicating machinery, forever unaware of its own existence. And we were the flukes and the fossils. We were the flightless birds lauding our own mastery over some remote island, while serpents and carnivores washed up on our shores. Susan James could not bring herself to concede that point, because Susan James, her multiple lives built on the faith that communication resolves all conflict, would then be forced to admit the lie. If Sarasti was right, there was no hope of reconciliation. A memory rose into my mind and stuck there. A man in motion, head bent, mouth twisted into an unrelenting grimace. His eyes focused on one foot, then the other. His legs moved stiffly, carefully. His arms moved not at all. He lurched like a zombie in thrall to rigor mortis. I knew what it was. Proprioceptive polyneuropathy, a case study I'd encountered in Consensus back before Spindle had died. This was what Pag had once compared me to, a man who had lost his mind. Only self-awareness remained. Deprived of the unconscious sense and subroutines he had always taken for granted, he'd had to focus on each and every step across the room. His body no longer knew where its limbs were or what they were doing. To move at all, to even remain upright, he had to bear constant witness. There'd been no sound when I'd played that file. There was none now in its recollection. But I swore I could feel Sarasti at my shoulder, peering into my memories. I swore I heard him speak in my mind like a schizophrenic hallucination. This is the best that consciousness can do when left on its own. Right answer, I murmured. Wrong question. What? Stretch, remember? When you asked it which objects were in the window. And it missed the scrambler, James nodded. So? It didn't miss the scrambler. You thought you were asking about the things it saw, the things that existed on the board. Stretch thought you were asking about the things it was aware of, she finished. He's right, I whispered. Oh God, I think he's right. Hey, James said. Did you see that? But I never saw what she was pointing at. Theseus slammed her eyelids shut and started howling. Graduation came 9 days early. We didn't see the shot. Whatever gunport Rorschach had opened was precisely eclipsed on three fronts. The lab hab hid it from Theseus, and two gnarled extrusions of the artifact itself hid it from each of the gun emplacements. A bolus of incendiary plasma shot from that blind spot like a thrown punch. It had split the inflatable wide open before the first alarm went up. Alarms chased us aft. We launched ourselves down the spine through the bridge, through the crypt, past hatches and crawl spaces, fleeing the surface for any refuge with more than a hand's breadth between skin and sky. Burrowing. Consensus followed us back, its windows warping and sliding across struts and conduits, and the concave tunnel of the spine itself. I paid no attention until we were back in the drum, deep in Theseus's belly, where we could pretend we were safer. Down on the turning deck, Bates erupted from the head, tactical windows swirling like ballroom dancers around her. Our own window came to rest on the Commons bulkhead. The hab expanded across that display like a cheap optical illusion, both swelling and shrinking in our sights, that smooth surface billowing toward us while collapsing in on itself. It took me a moment to reconcile the contradiction. Something had kicked the hab hard from its far side, sent it careening towards us in slow, majestic tumble. Something had opened the hab, spilled its atmosphere, and left its elastic skin drawing in on itself like a deflating balloon. The impact site swung into view as we watched, a scorched, flaccid mouth trailing tenuous wisps of frozen spittle. Our guns were firing. They shot non-conducting slugs that would not be turned aside by electromagnetic trickery. Invisibly dark and distant to human eyes, but I saw them through the tactical crosshairs of the firing robots, watched them sow twin-dotted black-bodied arcs across the heavens. The streams converged as the guns tracked their targets, closed on two attenuate throwing stars fleeing spread-eagled through the void, their faces turned to Rorschach like flowers in the sun. The guns cut them to pieces before they'd even made it halfway. But those shredded pieces kept falling, and suddenly the ground beneath was alive with motion. I zoomed the view. Scramblers surged across Rorschach's hull like an orgy of snakes, naked to space. Some linked arms, one to another, built squirming vertebral daisy chains anchored at one end. They lifted from the hull, waved through the radioactive vacuum like fronds of articulated kelp, reaching, grasping. Neither Bates nor her machines were stupid. They targeted the interlinked scramblers as ruthlessly as they'd gone after the escapees, and with a much higher total score. But there were simply too many targets, too many fragments snatched in passing. Twice I saw dismembered bits of Stretch and Clench caught by their brethren. The ruptured hab loomed across Consensus like a great torn leukocyte. Another alarm buzzed somewhere nearby. Proximity alert. Cunningham shot into the drum from somewhere astern, bounced off a cluster of pipes and conduits, grabbed for support.
Holy shit! We are leaving, aren't we? Amanda?
No, Sarasti answered from everywhere.
What does it fucking take?
I caught myself. Amanda, what if it fires on the ship? It won't. She didn't take her eyes from her windows. How do you... It can't. If it had spring-loaded any more firepower, we'd have seen a change in thermal and microallometry. Microallometry? I know what they're saying, but I don't know how to pronounce it. A false color landscape rotated between us, its latitudes measured in time, its longitudes in delta mass. Kilotons arose from that terrain like a range of red mountains. Huh. Came in just under the noise limit. Sarasti cut her off. Robert, Susan, EVA. James blanched.
What?
Cunningham cried. Lab module's about to impact, the vampire said. Salvage the samples. Now. He killed the channel before anyone could argue. But Cunningham wasn't about to argue. He'd just seen our death sentence commuted. Why would Sarasti care about retrieving biopsy samples if he didn't think we stood a chance of escaping with them? The biologist steadied himself, braced toward the forward hatch.
I'm there,
He said, shooting into the bow. I had to admit it. Sarasti's psychology was getting better. It wasn't working on James, though, or Michelle, or I couldn't quite tell who was on top. I can't go out there, Siri. I can't go out there. Just observe. Don't interfere. The ruptured inflatable collided impotently to starboard and flattened itself against the carapace. We felt nothing. Far away and far too near, the legions thinned across Rorschach's surface. They disappeared through mouths that puckered and dilated and magically closed again in the artifact's hull. The emplacements fired passionlessly at those who remained. Observe. The gang of four strobed at my side, scared to death. Don't interfere. It's okay, I said. I'll go. The open airlock was like a dimple in the face of an endless cliff. I looked out from that indentation into the abyss. This side of Theseus faced away from Big Ben, away from the enemy. The view was still unsettling enough, an endless panorama of distant stars, hard and cold and unwinking. A single, marginally brighter one, shining yellow, still so very far away. Any scant comfort I might have taken from that sight was lost when the sun went out for the briefest instant. A tumbling piece of rock, perhaps, or one of Rorschach's shovel-nosed entourage. One step and I might never stop falling. But I didn't step, and I didn't fall. I squeezed my pistol, jetted gently through the opening, turned. Theseus's carapace curved away from me in all directions. Toward the prow, the sealed observation blister arose above the horizon like a gunmetal sunrise. Farther aft, a tattered snowdrift peeked across the hull, the edge of the broken lab hab. And past it all, close enough to touch, the endless dark cloudscape of Big Ben, a great roiling wall extending to some flat, distant horizon I could barely grasp even in theory. When I focused, it was dark and endless shades of gray, but dim, sullen redness teased the corner of my eye when I looked away.
Robert?
Robert? I brought Cunningham's suit feed to my HUD. A craggy, motionless ice field thrown into high contrast by the light of his helmet. Interference from Rorschach's magnetosphere washed over the image in waves. You there? Pops and crackles. The sound of breath and mumbling against an electrical hum.
4.3, 4.0, 3.8.
Robert?
3. Shit! What are you doing out here, Keaton? Where's the gang?
I came instead. Another squeeze of the trigger, and I was coasting toward the snowscape. Theseus's convex hull rolled past, just within reach. To give you a hand.
Let's move it then, shall we?
He was passing through a crevice, a scorched and jagged tear in the fabric that folded back at his touch. Struts, broken panels, dead robot arms tangled through the interior of the ice cave like glacial debris. Their outlines writhed with static, their shadows leaped and stretched like living things in the sweep of his headlight.
I'm almost...
Something that wasn't static moved in his headlight. Something uncoiled just at the edge of the camera's view. The feed died. Suddenly, Bates and Sarasti were shouting in my helmet. I tried to brake. My stupid, useless legs kicked against vacuum, obeying some ancient brainstem override from a time when all monsters were earthbound. But by the time I remembered to use my trigger finger, the lab hab was already looming before me. Rorschach reared up behind it in the near distance, vast and malign. Dim green auroras writhed across its twisted surface like sheet lightning. Mouths opened and closed by the hundreds, viscous as bubbling volcanic mud, any one of them large enough to swallow Theseus whole. I barely noticed the flicker of motion just ahead of me, the silent eruption of dark mass from the collapsed inflatable. By the time Cunningham caught my eye, he was already on his way, backlit against the ghastly corpse light flickering on Rorschach's skin. I thought I saw him waving, but I was wrong. It was only the scrambler wrapped around his body like a desperate lover, moving his arm back and forth while it ran the thrust pistol tethered to his wrist. Bye-bye, that arm seemed to say, and fuck you, Keaton. I watched for what seemed like forever, but no other part of him moved at all. Voices, shouting, ordering me back inside. I hardly heard them. I was too dumbfounded by the basic math, trying to make sense of the simplest subtraction. Two scramblers, stretch and clench, both accounted for, shot to pieces before my eyes.
Keaton, do you read? Get back here. Acknowledge.
It, it can't be, I heard myself say. There were only two.
Return to ship immediately. Acknowledge.
I acknowledged. Rorschach's mouth snapped shut at once, as though holding a deep breath. The artifact began to turn, ponderously, a continent changing course. It receded, slowly at first, picking up speed, turning tail and running. How odd, I thought. Maybe it's more afraid than we are. But then Rorschach blew us a kiss. I saw it burst from deep within the forest, ethereal and incandescent. It shot across the heavens and splashed against the hull of Theseus's back, making a complete and utter fool of Amanda Bates. The skin of our ship flowed there and opened like a mouth and congealed in a soundless, frozen scream. You cannot prevent and prepare for war at the same time. I have no idea whether the Scrambler made it back home with its hard-won prize. There was so much lost distance to make up, even if the emplacements didn't pick it off en route. Cunningham's pistol might have run out of fuel. And who knew how long those creatures could survive in vacuum anyway? Maybe there'd been no real hope of success. Maybe that Scrambler was dead from the moment it had gambled on staying behind. I never found out. It had dwindled and vanished from my sight long before Rorschach dove beneath the clouds and disappeared in turn. There had always been three, of course. Stretch and Clench, and the half-forgotten microwaved remains of a Scrambler killed by an uppity grunt, kept on ice next to its living brethren, within easy reach of Cunningham's teleops. I tried to dredge half-glimpsed details from memory, after the fact. Had both of those escapees been spheres, or had one been flattened along one axis? Had they thrashed, waved their limbs the way some panicky human might with no ground beneath him? Or had one, perhaps, coasted lifeless and ballistic until our guns destroyed the evidence? At this point, it didn't really matter. What mattered was that at long last, everyone was on the same page. Blood had been drawn. War declared. And Theseus was paralyzed from the waist down. Rorschach's parting shot had punched through the carapace at the base of the spine. It had just missed the ram scoop and the telematter assembly. It might have taken out Fab if it hadn't spent so many joules burning through the carapace, but barring some temporary pulse effects, it left all critical systems pretty much operational. All it had done was weaken Theseus's backbone enough to make it snap in two should we ever burn hard enough to break orbit. The ship would be able to repair that damage, but not in time. If it had been luck, it would have been remarkable. And now, its quarry disabled, Rorschach had vanished. It had everything it needed from us, for the moment at least. It had information, all the experiences and insights encoded in the salvaged limbs of its martyred spies. If Stretch or Clench's gamble had paid off, it even had a specimen of its own now, in which, all things considered, we could hardly begrudge it. And so now it lurked invisibly in the depths, resting, perhaps, recharging. But it would be back. Theseus lost weight for the final round. We shut down the drum in a token attempt to reduce our vulnerable allotment of moving parts. The gang of four, uncommanded, unneeded, the very reason for their existence ripped away, retreated into some inner dialogue to which other flesh was unwelcome. She floated in the observatory, her eyes closed as tightly as the leaded lids around her. I could not tell who was in control. I guessed. Michelle? Siri. Susan. Susan. Just go. Bates floated near the floor of the drum, windows arrayed externally across bulkhead and conference table. What can I do? I asked. She didn't look up. Nothing. So I watched. Bates counted skimmers in one window, mass, inertia, any of a dozen variables that would prove far too constant should any of those shovel-nosed missiles come at our throat. They had finally noticed us. Their chaotic electron dance was shifting now, hundreds of thousands of colossal sledgehammers in sudden flux, reweaving into some ominous dynamic that hadn't yet settled into anything we could predict. In another window, Rorschach's vanishing act replayed on endless loop, a radar image receding deep into the maelstrom, fading beneath gaseous teratons of radio static. It might still be in orbit, of sorts. Judging by that last glimpsed trajectory, Rorschach might well be swinging around Ben's core now, passing through the crushed layers of methane and monoxide that would flatten Theseus into smoke. Maybe it didn't even stop there. Maybe Rorschach could pass unharmed even through those vaster, deeper pressures that made iron and hydrogen run liquid. We didn't know. We only knew that it would be back in a little under 2 hours, assuming it maintained its trajectory and survived the depths. And of course, it would survive. You can't kill the thing under the bed. You can only keep it outside the covers. And only for a while. A thumbnail inset caught my eye with a flash of color. At my command, it grew into a swirling soap bubble, incongruously beautiful, a blue-shifted coruscating rainbow of blown glass. I didn't recognize it for a moment. Big Ben, rendered in some prismatic false color enhance I'd never seen before. I grunted softly. Bates glanced up. Oh, beautiful, isn't it? What's the spectrum? Long-wave stuff. Visible red, infra, down a ways. Good for heat traces. Visible red? There wasn't any to speak of, mostly cool plasma fractals in 100 shades of jade and sapphire. Quadrichromatic palette, Bates told me, like what a cat might see. Or a vampire. She managed a half-hearted wave at the rainbow bubble. Sarasti sees something like that every time he looks outside. If he ever looks outside. You'd think he'd have mentioned it, I murmured. It was gorgeous, a holographic ornament. Maybe even Rorschach might be a work of art through eyes like these. I don't think they parse sight like we do. Bates opened another window. Mundane graphs and contour plots sprang from the table. They don't even go to heaven, from what I hear. VR doesn't work on them. They see the pixels or something. What if he's right? I asked. I told myself that I was only looking for a tactical assessment, an official opinion for the official record. But my words came out doubtful and frightened. She paused. For a moment I wondered if she, too, had finally lost patience with the sight of me. But she only looked up and stared off into some enclosed distance. What if he's right? She repeated, and pondered the question that lay beneath. What can we do?
We could engineer ourselves back into non-sentience, perhaps. Might improve our odds in the long run.
She looked at me, a rueful sort of half smile at the corner of her mouth. But I guess that wouldn't be much of a win, would it? What's the difference between being dead and just not knowing you're alive? I finally saw it. How long would it take an enemy tactician to discern Bates's mind behind the actions of her troops on the battlefield? How long before the obvious logic became clear? In any combat situation, this woman would naturally draw the greatest amount of enemy fire, take off the head, kill the body. But Amanda Bates wasn't just a head. She was a bottleneck, and her body would not suffer from a decapitation strike. Her death would only let her troops off the leash. How much more deadly would those grunts be once every battlefield reflex didn't have to pass through some interminable job stack waiting for the rubber stamp? Spindle had had it all wrong. Amanda Bates wasn't a sop to politics. Her role didn't deny the obsolescence of human oversight at all. Her role depended on it. She was more cannon fodder than I. She always had been. And I had to admit, after generations of generals who'd lived for the glory of the mushroom cloud, it was a pretty effective strategy for souring warmongers on gratuitous violence. In Amanda Bates's army, picking a fight meant standing on the battlefield with a bullseye on your chest. No wonder she'd been so invested in peaceful alternatives. I'm sorry, I said, softly. She shrugged. It's not over yet. Just the first round. She took a long, deep breath and turned back to her study of slingshot mechanics. Rorschach wouldn't have tried so hard to scare us off in the first place if we couldn't touch it, right? I swallowed. Right. So there's still a chance. She nodded to herself. There's still a chance. Ever optimistic, Amanda Bates. The demon arranged his whoops. The demon arranged his pieces for the end game. He didn't have many left. The soldier he placed in the bridge. He packed obsolete linguists and diplomats back in their coffin, out of sight and out of the way. He called the Jargonaut to his quarters, and although it would be the first time I'd seen him since the attack, his summons carried not the slightest trace of doubt that I would obey. I did. I came on command, and saw that he had surrounded himself with faces. Every last one of them was screaming. There was no sound. The disembodied holograms floated in silent tears around the bubble, each contorted into a different expression of pain. They were being tortured, these faces. Half a dozen real ethnicities and twice as many hypothetical ones, skin tones ranging from charcoal to albino, brows high and slanted, noses splayed or pointed, jaws receding or prognathous. Sarasti had called the entire hominid tree into existence around him, astonishing in their range of features, terrifying in their consistency of expression. A sea of tortured faces rotating in slow orbits around my vampire commander. My God, what is this? Statistics. Sarasti seemed focused on a flayed Asian child. Rorschach's growth allometry over a 2-week period. Their faces. He nodded, turning his attention to a woman with no eyes. Skull diameter scales to total mass. Mandible length scales to EM transparency at 1 angstrom. 113 facial dimensions, each presenting a different variable. Principal component combinations present as multi-feature aspect ratios. He turned to face me, his naked, gleaming eyes just slightly side-cast. You'd be surprised at how much gray matter is dedicated to the analysis of facial imagery. Shame to waste it on anything as counterintuitive as residual plots or contingency tables. I felt my jaw clenching. And their expressions? What do they represent? Software customizes output for user. An agonized gallery pled for mercy on all sides. "I am wired for hunting," he reminded gently. "And you think I don't know that?" I asked after a moment. He shrugged, disconcertingly human. "You ask." "Why am I here, Yuka? You want to teach me another object lesson?"
"To discuss our next move."
"What move? We can't even run away."
"No."
He shook his head, baring filed teeth in something approaching regret. Why did we wait so long? Suddenly my sullen defiance had evaporated. I sounded like a child, frightened and pleading. Why didn't we just take it on when we first got here, when it was weaker?
"We need to learn things. For next time."
Next time? I thought Rorschach was a dandelion seed. I thought it just washed up here.
"By chance. But every dandelion is a clone. Their seeds are legion."
Another smile, not remotely convincing.
"And maybe it takes more than one try for the placental mammals to conquer Australia."
It'll annihilate us. It doesn't even need those spitballs. It could pulverize us with one of those scramjets in an instant.
"It doesn't want to.
How do you know?
They need to learn things too. They want us intact. Improves our odds."
Not enough. We can't win. This was his cue. This was the point at which Uncle Predator would smile at my naivete and take me into his confidence.
"Of course we're armed to the teeth," he would say. "Do you think we'd come all this way, face such a vast unknown, without the means to defend ourselves? Now, at last, I can reveal that shielding and weaponry account for over half the ship's mass."
It was his cue.
"No," he said, "we can't win."
So we just sit here. We just wait to die for the next 68 minutes. Sarasti shook his head.
"No."
But I began. Oh, I finished. Because, of course, we had just topped up our antimatter reserves. Theseus was not equipped with weapons. Theseus was the weapon. And we were, in fact, going to sit here for the next 68 minutes, waiting to die. But we were going to take Rorschach with us when we did. Sarasti said nothing. I wondered what he saw looking at me. I wondered if there actually was a Yuka Sarasti behind those eyes to see, if his insights, always 10 steps ahead of our own, hailed not so much from superior analytical facilities as from the time-worn truth that it takes one to know one. Whose side, I wondered, would an automaton take?
"You have other things to worry about," he said.
He moved toward me. I swear all those agonized faces followed him with their eyes. He studied me for a moment, the flesh crinkling around his eyes. Or maybe some mindless algorithm merely processed visual input, correlated aspect ratios and facial tics, fed everything to some output subroutine with no more awareness than a stats program. Maybe there was no more spark in this creature's face than there was in all the others, silently screaming in his wake.
"Is Susan afraid of you?"
The thing before me asked. Why should she be?
"She has 4 conscious entities in her head. She's 4 times more sentient than you. Doesn't that make you a threat?"
No, of course not.
"Then why should you feel threatened by me?"
And suddenly I didn't care anymore. I laughed out loud, with minutes to live and nothing to lose. Why? Maybe because I know you're my natural enemy, you fucker. Maybe because I know you, and you can't even look at one of us without flexing your claws. Maybe because you nearly ripped my fucking hand off and raped me for no good reason.
"I can imagine what it's like," he said quietly. "Please don't make me do it again."
I fell instantly silent.
"I know your race and mine are never on the best of terms."
There was a cold smile in his voice, if not in his face.
But I do only what you force me to. You rationalize, Keaton. You defend. You reject unpalatable truths, and if you can't reject them outright, you trivialize them. Incremental evidence is never enough for you. You hear rumors of Holocaust. You dismiss them. You see evidence of genocide. You insist it can't be so bad. Temperatures rise, glaciers melt, species die, and you blame sunspots and volcanoes. Everyone is like this, but you most of all. You and your Chinese room. You turn incomprehension into mathematics. You reject the truth without even hearing it first.
It served me well enough. I wondered at the ease with which I had put my life into the past tense.
Yes, if your purpose is only to transmit, now you have to convince. You have to believe.
There were implications there that I didn't dare to hope for. Are you saying
Can't afford to let the truth trickle through. Can't give you the chance to shore up your rationales and your defenses. They must fall completely. You must be inundated, shattered. Genocide's impossible to deny when you're buried up to your neck in dismembered bodies.
you played me? I whispered. All this time. I'd known something was going on. I just hadn't understood what. I'd have seen right through it, I told him, if you hadn't made me get involved.
You might even read it off me directly.
That's why you. I shook my head. I thought that was because we were meat.
That too.
Sarasti admitted, and looked right at me. For the first time, I looked right back, and felt a shock of recognition. I still wonder why I never saw it before. For all those years, I remembered the thoughts and feelings of some different, younger person, some remnant of the boy my parents had hacked out of my head to make room for me. He'd been alive. His world had been vibrant. And though I could call up the memories of that other consciousness, I could barely feel anything within the constraints of my own. Perhaps dream state wasn't such a bad word for it.
Like to hear a vampire folktale?
Sarasti asked. Vampires have folk tales? He took it for a yes.
A laser is assigned to find the darkness. Since it lives in a room without doors or windows or any other source of light, it thinks this will be easy. But everywhere it turns, it sees brightness. Every wall, every piece of furniture it points at is brightly lit. Eventually, it concludes there is no darkness, that light is everywhere.
What the hell are you talking about?
Amanda is not planning a mutiny.
What? You know about.
She doesn't even want to. Ask her if you like.
No, I.
You value objectivity.
It was so obvious I didn't bother answering. He nodded as if I had.
Synthesists can't have opinions of their own. So when you feel one, it must be someone else's. The crew holds you in contempt. Amanda wants me relieved of command. Half of us is you. I think the word is project. Although, he cocked his head a bit to one side, lately you improve. Come,
Where?
Shuttle Bay. Time to do your job.
My.
Survive and bear witness.
A drone.
Can deliver the data, assuming nothing fries its memory before it gets away. It can't convince anyone. It can't counter rationalizations and denials. It can't matter. And vampires, he paused, have poor communication skills.
It should have been cause for petty, selfish rejoicing. It all comes down to me, I said. That's what you're saying. I'm a fucking stenographer, and it's all on me.
Yes, forgive me for that.
Forgive you? Sarasti waved his hand. All faces save two disappeared. I don't know what I'm doing. Or rather,
I don't know what I'm doing.
I'm not sure which one that is. I think it is Sarasti. You should probably be scared now. You should be very scared. When the vampire doesn't know what's going on, there's a problem. The news bloomed across Consensus a few seconds before Bates called it aloud. 13 skimmers had not reappeared from behind Big Ben on schedule. 16. 28. And counting. Sarasti clicked to himself as he and Bates played catch-up. Tactical, filled with luminous multicolored threads, a tangle of revised projections as intricate as art. The threads wrapped Ben in like a filamentous cocoon. Theseus was a naked speck in the middle distance. I expected any number of those lines to skewer us like needles through a bug. Surprisingly, none did, but the projections only extended 25 hours into the future, and were reliable for only half that. Not even Sarasti and the captain could look so far ahead with that many balls in the air. It was something, though, the faintest silver lining, that all these high-speed behemoths couldn't simply reach out and swat us without warning. Evidently, they still had to ease into the curve. After Rorschach's dive, I'd been starting to think the laws of physics didn't apply. Sarasti reached for his injector, the blood rising in his face.
Time to go. We'll retrofit Charybdis while you're sulking.
He held the hypo to his throat and shot up. I stared at Consensus, caught by that bright, shifting web like a moth by a streetlight.
Now, Siri.
He pushed me from his quarters. I sailed into the passageway, grabbing a convenient rung, and stopped. The spine was alive with grunts, patrolling the airspace, standing guard over the fab plants and shuttle locks, clinging like giant insects to the rungs of unrolling spinal ladders. Slowly, silently, the spine itself was stretching. It could do that, I remembered. Its corrugations flexed and relaxed like muscle. It could grow up to 200 meters to accommodate any late-breaking need for a bigger hangar or more lab space. Or more infantry. Theseus was increasing the size of the battlefield.
Come.
The vampire turned aft. Bates broke in from up front. Something's happening. An emergency hand pad, geckoed to the expanding bulkhead, slid past to one side. Sarasti grabbed it and tapped commands. Bates's feed appeared on the bulkhead, a tiny chunk of Big Ben, an EM-enhanced equatorial quadrant only a few thousand clicks on a side. The clouds boiled down there, a cyclonic knot of turbulence swirling almost too fast for real time. The overlay described charged particles bound in a deep Parker spiral. It spoke of great mass, rising. Sarasti clicked. DTI? Bates said.
Optical only.
Sarasti took my arm and dragged me effortlessly astern. The display paced us along the wall bulkhead. 7 skimmers shot from the clouds as I watched, a ragged circle of scramjets screaming red-hot into space. Consensus plotted their paths in an instant. Luminous arcs rose around our ship like the bars of a cage. Theseus shuddered. We've been hit, I thought. Suddenly, the spine's plodding expansion cranked into overdrive. The pleated wall lurched and accelerated, streaming past my outstretched fingers as the closed hatch receded up ahead. Receded overhead. The walls weren't moving at all. We were falling to the sudden strident bleating of an alarm. Something nearly yanked my arm from its socket. Sarasti had reached out with one hand and caught a rung, reached with his other and caught me before we'd both been flattened against the fab plant. We dangled. I must have weighed 200 kilograms. The floor shuddered 10 meters below my feet. The ship groaned around us. The spine filled with the screech of torquing metal. Bates's grunts clung to its walls with clawed feet. I reached for the ladder. The ladder pulled away. The ship was bending in the middle and down had started to climb the walls. Sarasti and I swung toward the center of the spine like a daisy-chained pendulum. "Bates! James!" the vampire roared. His grip on my wrist trembled, slipping. I strained for the ladder, swung, caught it. "Susan James has barricaded herself in the bridge and shut down autonomic overrides." An unfamiliar voice, flat and affectless. "She has initiated an unauthorized burn. I have begun a controlled reactor shutdown. Be advised that the main drive will be offline for at least 27 minutes. The ship, I realized, its voice raised calmly above the alarm. The captain itself, on public address. That was unusual. "Bridge!" Sarasti barked. "Open channel!" Someone was shouting up there. There were words, but I couldn't make them out. Without warning, Sarasti let go. He dropped obliquely in a blur. Aft and opposite, the bulkhead waited to swat him like an insect. In half a second, both his legs would be shattered, if the impact didn't kill him outright. But suddenly we were weightless again, and Yuka Sarasti, purple-faced, stiff-limbed, was foaming at the mouth. "Reactor offline," the captain reported. Sarasti bounced off the wall. He's having a seizure, I realized. I released the ladder and pushed astern. Theseus swung lopsidedly around me. Sarasti convulsed in midair. Clicks and hisses and choking sounds stuttered from his mouth. His eyes were so wide they seemed lidless. His pupils were mirror-red pinpoints. The flesh twitched across his face as though trying to crawl off. Ahead and behind, BattleBots held their position and ignored us. "Bates!" I yelled up the spine. "We need help!" Angles everywhere. Seams on the shield plates. Sharp shadows and protrusions on the surface of every drone. A 2x3 matrix of insets, bordered in black, floating over the main consensus display. Two big interlinked crosses right in front of where Sarasti had been hanging. This can't be happening. He just took his anti-Euclideans. I saw him. Unless someone had spiked Sarasti's drugs. "Bates!" She should be linked into the grunts. They should have leapt forward at the first sign of trouble. They should be dragging my commander to the infirmary by now. They waited, stolid and immobile. I stared at the nearest. "Bates, you there?" And then, in case she wasn't, I spoke to the grunt directly. "Are you autonomous? Do you take verbal orders?" On all sides, the robots watched. The captain just laughed at me, its voice posing as an alarm. Infirmary. I pushed. Sarasti's arms flailed randomly against my head and shoulders. He tumbled forward and sideways, hit the moving consensus display dead center, bounced away up the spine. I kicked off in his wake, and glimpsed something from the corner of my eye, and turned. And dead center of consensus, Rorschach erupted from Ben's seething face like a breaching whale. It wasn't just the EM enhance, the thing was glowing. Deep, angry red. Enraged, it hurled itself into space, big as a mountain range. Fuck, fuck, fuck. Theseus lurched. The lights flickered, went out, came back on again. The turning bulkhead cuffed me from behind. "Backups engaged," the captain said calmly. "Captain! Sarasti's down!" I kicked off the nearest ladder, bumped into a grunt, and headed forward after the vampire. "Bates isn't... What should I do?" "Nav offline. Starboard afferents offline." It wasn't even talking to me, I realized. Maybe this wasn't the captain at all. Maybe it was pure reflex, a dialogue tree spouting public service announcements. Maybe Theseus had already been lobotomized. Maybe this was only her brainstem talking. Darkness again, then flickering light. If the captain was gone, we were screwed. I gave Sarasti another push. The alarm bleated on. The drum was 20 meters ahead. Biomed was just the other side of that closed hatch. The hatch had been open before, I remembered. Someone had shut it in the last few minutes. Fortunately, Theseus had no locks on her doors. Unless the gang barricaded it before they took the bridge.
Strap in, people. We are getting out of here.
Who in hell? The open bridge channel. Oh, whoops, wrong person. Strap in, people. We are getting out of here. Who in hell? The open bridge channel. Susan James shouting up there. Or someone was. I couldn't quite place the voice. 10 meters to the drum. Theseus jerked again, slowed her spin. Stabilized. Somebody start the goddamn reactor. I've only got attitude jets up here. Susan? Sasha? I was at the hatch. Who is that? I pushed past Sarasti and reached to open it. No answer. Not from Consensus, anyway. I heard a muted hum from behind, saw the ominous shifting of shadows on the bulkhead just a moment too late. I turned in time to see one of the grunts raise a spiky appendage, curved like a scimitar, needle-tipped, over Sarasti's head. I turned in time to see it plunge into his skull. I froze. The metal proboscis withdrew, dark and slick. Lateral maxillipeds began nibbling at the base of Sarasti's skull. His pithed corpse wasn't thrashing now. It only trembled, a sack of muscles and motor nerves awash in static. Bates. Her mutiny was underway. No, their mutiny. Bates and the gang. I'd known. I'd imagined it. I'd seen it coming. He hadn't believed me. The lights went out again. The alarm fell silent. Consensus dwindled to a flickering doodle on the bulkhead and disappeared. I saw something there in that last instant and refused to process it. I heard breath catch in my throat, felt angular monstrosities advancing through the darkness. Something flared directly ahead, a bright, brief staccato in the void. I glimpsed curves and angles in silhouette, staggering. The buzzing crackle of shorting circuitry. Metal objects collided nearby, unseen. From behind the crinkle of the drum hatch, opening. I turned. A sudden beam of harsh chemical light hit me and lit the mechanical ranks behind. They simultaneously unclamped from their anchorages and floated free. Their joints clicked in unison like an army stamping to attention.
Keaton!
Bates snapped, sailing through the hatch.
You okay?
The chem lights shone from her forehead. It turned the interior of the spine into a high-contrast mosaic, all pale surfaces and sharp-moving shadows. It spilled across the grunt that had killed Sarasti. The robot bounced down the spine, suddenly, mysteriously inert. The light washed across Sarasti's body. The corpse turned slowly on its axis. Spherical crimson beads emerged from its head like drops of water from a leaky faucet. They spread in a winding, widening trail, spotlit by Bates's headlamp, a spiral arm of dark ruby suns. I backed away. You... She pushed me to one side.
Stay clear of the hatch, unless you're going through.
Her eyes were fixed on the ranked drones.
Optical line of sight.
Rows of glassy eyes reflected back at us down the passageway, passing in and out of shadow.
You killed Sarasti.
No.
But who do you think shut it down, Keaton? The fucker went rogue. I could barely even get it to self-destruct.
Her eyes went briefly deep focus. All down the spine, the surviving drones launched into some intricate martial ballet, half seen in the shifting cone of her headlamp.
Better, Bates said. They should stay in line now, assuming we don't get hit with anything too much stronger.
What is hitting us?
Lightning. EMP.
Drones sailed down to Fab and the shuttles, taking strategic positions along the tube.
Rorschach's putting out one hell of a charge, and every time one of those skimmers pass between us, they arc.
What, at this range? I thought we were...
The burn sent us in the wrong direction. We're inbound.
3 grunts, close enough to touch. They drew beads on the open drum hatch.
She said she was trying to escape, I remembered. She fucked up.
Not by that much. She couldn't have. We were all rated for manual piloting, just in case. Not the gang, Bates said. But I think there's someone new in there now. Bunch of sub-modules wired together and woke up somehow. I don't know. But whatever's in charge, I think it's just panicking. Stuttering brightness on all sides. The spinal light strips flickered and finally held steady at half their usual brightness. Theseus coughed static and spoke. Consensus is offline. React. The voice faded. Consensus, I remembered as Bates turned to head back upstream. I saw something, I said, before consensus went out. Yeah? Was that? She paused at the hatch. Yeah? I'd seen scramblers. Hundreds of them, sailing naked through the void, their arms spread wide. Some of their arms, anyway. They were carrying... Bates nodded. Weapons. Her eyes flickered to some unseen distance for a moment. First wave headed for the front end. Blister and forward lock, I think. Second wave's aft. She shook her head. Huh, I would have done it the other way around. How far? Far? Bates smiled faintly. They're already on the hull, Siri. We're engaging. What do I do? What do I do? Her eyes stared past me and widened. She opened her mouth. A hand clamped on my shoulder from behind and spun me around. Sarasti. His dead eyes stared from a skull split like a spiked melon. Globules of coagulating blood clung to his hair and skin like engorged ticks. Go with him, Bates said. Sarasti grunted and clicked. There were no words. What? Now. That's an order. Bates turned back to the hatch. We'll cover you. The shuttle. You too. You too. No. Why not? They can fight better without you. You said that yourself. What's the point? Can't leave yourself a back door, Keaton. Defeats the whole purpose. She allowed herself a small, sad smile. They've breached. Go. She was gone, fresh alarms rising in her wake. Far toward the bow, I heard the crinkle of emergency bulkheads snapping shut. Sarasti's undead carcass gurgled and pushed me down the spine. 4 more grunts slid smoothly past and took up position behind us. I looked over my shoulder in time to see the vampire pull the handpad from the wall. But it wasn't Sarasti at all, of course. This was the captain. Whatever was left of the captain, this far into the fight, commandeering a peripheral interface for its own use. The optical port sprouted conspicuously from the back of Sarasti's neck, where the cable used to go in. I remembered the drone's maxillipeds chewing. The sound of weapons fire and ricochets rose behind us. The corpse typed one-handed as we moved. I wondered briefly why it just didn't talk before my gaze flickered back to the spike in its brain. Sarasti's speech centers must be mush. Why did you kill him? I said. A whole new alarm started up, way back in the drum. A sudden breeze tugged me backward for a moment, dissipated in the next second with a distant clang. The corpse held out the handpad, configured for keys and a text display. Seizing. Couldn't control. We were at the shuttle locks. Robot soldiers let us pass, their attention elsewhere. You go, the captain said. Someone screamed in the distance. Way off up the spine, the drum hatch slammed shut. I turned and saw a pair of distant grunts welding the seal. They seemed to move faster now than they ever had before. Maybe it was only my imagination. The starboard shuttle lock slid back. Charybdis's interior lights winked on, spilling brightness into the passageway. The spine's emergency lighting seemed even dimmer in contrast. I peered through the opening. There was almost no cabin space left, just a single open coffin jammed between coolant and fuel tanks and massive retrofitted shock pads. Charybdis had been refitted for high G and long distance. And me. Sarasti's corpse urged me on from behind. I turned and faced it. Was it ever him? I asked. Go. Tell me, did he ever speak for himself? Did he decide anything on his own? Were we ever following his orders? Or was it just you all along? Sarasti's undead eyes stared glassy and uncomprehending. His fingers jerked on the handpad. You dislike orders from machines. Happier this way. I let it strap me in and closed the lid. I lay there in the dark, feeling my body lurch and sway as the shuttle slid into its launch slot. I withstood the sudden silence as the docking clamps let go, the jerk of acceleration that spat me hard into the vacuum, the ongoing thrust that pushed against my chest like a soft mountain. Around me, the shuttle trembled in the throes of a burn that far exceeded its normative specs. My inlays came back online. Suddenly, I could see outside if I wanted. I could see what was happening behind me. I chose not to, deliberately and fervently, and looked anyway. Theseus was dwindling by then, not even on tactical. She listed down the well, wobbling toward some enemy rendezvous that must have been intentional, some last-second maneuver to get her payload as close to the target as possible. Rorschach rose to meet her, its gnarled, spiky arms uncoiling, spreading as if in anticipation of an embrace. But it was the backdrop, not the players, that stole the tableau. The face of Big Ben, roiling in my rear view, a seething cyclonic backdrop filling the window. Magnetic contours wound spring-tight on the overlay. Rorschach was drawing all of Ben's magnetosphere around itself like a bright, swirling cloak, twisting it into a concentrated knot that grew and brightened and bulged outward. Like a torsion flare from an L-class dwarf, my commander had said once. But we should see anything big enough to generate that effect, and the sky's dark on that bearing. IAU calls it a statistical artifact. As, in fact, it had been. An impact splash, perhaps, or the bright, brief bellow of some great energy source rebooting after 1,000,000 years of dormancy. Much like this one. A solar flare, with no sun beneath it. A magnetic cannon 10,000 times stronger than nature gave it any right to be. Both sides drew their weapons. I don't know which fired first, or even if it mattered. How many tons of antimatter would it take to match something that could squeeze the power of a sun from a gas ball barely wider than Jupiter? Was Rorschach also resigned to defeat? Had each side opted for a kamikaze strike on the other? I don't know. Big Ben got in the way just minutes before the explosion. That's probably why I'm still alive. Ben stood between me and that burning light like a coin held against the sun. Theseus sent everything it could until the last microsecond. Every recorded moment of hand-to-hand combat, every last countdown, every last soul. All the moves and all the vectors. I have that telemetry. I can break it down into any number of shapes, continuous or discrete. I can transform the topology, rotate it, and compress it, and serve it up in dialects that any ally might be able to use. Perhaps Sarasti was right. Perhaps some of it is vital. I don't know what any of it means. Part 3. Part 3. Charybdis. Species used to go extinct. Now they go on hiatus. Deborah McLennan, Tables of Our Reconstruction. You poor guy, Chelsea said as we went our separate ways. Sometimes I don't think you'll ever be lonely. At the time, I wondered why she sounded so sad. Now, I only wish she'd been right. I know this hasn't been a seamless narrative. I've had to shatter the story and string its fragments out along a death lasting decades. I live for only an hour out of every 10,000 now, you see. I wish I didn't have to. If only I could sleep the whole way back, avoid the agony of these brief, time-lapsed resurrections. If only I wouldn't die in my sleep if I tried. But living bodies glitter with a lifetime's accumulation of embedded radioisotopes, brilliant little shards that degrade cellular machinery at the molecular level. It's not usually a problem. Living cells repair the damage as fast as it occurs. But my undead ones let those errors accumulate over time, and the journey home takes so much longer than the trip out. I lie in stasis and corrode. So the onboard kickstarts me every now and then to give my flesh the chance to stitch itself back together. Occasionally it talks to me, recites system stats, updates me on any chatter from back home. Mostly, though, it leaves me alone with my thoughts and the machinery ticking away where my left hemisphere used to be. So I talk to myself, dictate history and opinion from real hemisphere to synthetic one. Bright, brief moments of awareness, long years of oblivious decay between. Maybe the whole exercise is pointless from the start. Maybe no one's even listening. It doesn't matter. This is what I do. So there you have it. A memoir told from meat to machinery. A tale told to myself for lack of someone else to take an interest. Anyone with half a brain could tell it. Alternatively, anyone with half a brain could tell it. Inflection might matter there. Sorry. I got a letter from Dad today. General delivery, he called it. I think that was a joke, in deference to my lack of known address. He just threw it omnidirectionally into the ether and hoped it would wash over me, wherever I was. It's been almost 14 years now. You lose track of such things out here. Helen's dead. Heaven malfunctioned, apparently, or was sabotaged. Maybe the realists finally pulled it off. I doubt it, though. Dad seemed to think someone else was responsible. He didn't offer up any details. Maybe he didn't know any. He spoke uneasily of increasing unrest back home. Maybe someone leaked my communiques about Rorschach. Maybe people drew the obvious conclusion when our postcards stopped arriving. They don't know how the story ended. The lack of closure must be driving them crazy. But I got the sense there was something else, something my father didn't dare speak aloud. Maybe it's just my imagination. I thought he even sounded troubled by the news that the birth rate was rising again, which should be cause for celebration after a generation in decline. If my Chinese room was still in proper working order, I'd know. I'd be able to parse it down to the punctuation. But Sarasti battered my tools and left them barely functional. I'm as blind now as any baseline. All I have is uncertainty and suspicion, and the creeping dread that even with my best tricks in tatters, I might be reading him right. I think he's warning me to stay away. He also said he loved me. He said he missed Helen, that she was sorry for something she did before I was born, some indulgence or omission that carried developmental consequences. He rambled. I don't know what he was talking about. So much power my father must have had, to be able to authorize such a broadcast and yet waste so much of it on feelings. Oh God, how I treasure it. I treasure every word. I fall along an endless, futile parabola, all gravity and inertia. Charybdis couldn't reacquire the antimatter stream. Icarus has either been knocked out of alignment or shut off entirely. I suppose I could radio ahead and ask, but there's no hurry. I'm still a long way out. It'll be years before I even leave the comets behind. Besides, I'm not sure I want anyone to know where I am. Charybdis doesn't bother with evasive maneuvers. There'd be no point even if it had the fuel to spare, even if the enemy's still out there somewhere. It's not as though they don't know where Earth is. But I'm pretty sure the scramblers went up along with my own kin. They played well. I admit it freely. Or maybe they just got lucky. An accidental hiccup tickles Bates's grunt into firing on an unarmed scrambler. Weeks later, Stretch and Clench use that body in the course of their escape. Electricity and magnetism stir random neurons in Susan's head. Farther down the timeline, a whole new persona erupts to take control, to send Theseus diving into Rorschach's waiting arms. Blind, stupid, random chance. Maybe that's all it was. But I don't think so. Too many lucky coincidences. I think Rorschach made its own luck, planted and watered that new persona right under our noses, safely hidden, but for the merest trace of elevated oxytocin, behind all the lesions and tumors sown in Susan's head. I think it looked ahead and saw the uses to which a decoy might be put. I think it sacrificed a little piece of itself in furtherance of that end, and made it look like an accident. Blind, maybe, but not luck. Foresight. Brilliant moves, and subtle. Not that most of us even knew the rules of the game, of course. We were just pawns, really. Sarasti and the captain, whatever hybridized intelligence those two formed, they were the real players. Looking back, I can see a few of their moves, too. I see Theseus hearing the scramblers tap back and forth in their cages. I see her tweak the volume on the gang's feed so that Susan hears it as well, and thinks the discovery her own. If I squint hard enough, I even glimpse Theseus offering us up in sacrifice, deliberately provoking Rorschach to retaliation with that final approach. Sarasti was always enamored of data, especially when it had tactical significance. What better way to assess one's enemy than to observe it in combat? They never told us, of course. We were happier that way. We disliked orders from machines. Not that we were all that crazy about taking them from a vampire. And now the game is over, and a single pawn stands on that scorched board, and its face is human after all. If the scramblers follow the rules that a few generations of game theorists have laid out for them, they won't be back. Even if they are, I suspect it won't make any difference. Because by then, there won't be any basis for conflict. I've been listening to the radio during these intermittent awakenings. It's been generations since we buried the broadcast age in tight beams and fiber op, but we never completely stopped sowing EM through the heavens. Earth, Mars, and Luna conduct their interplanetary trialogue in a million overlapping voices. Every ship cruising the void speaks in all directions at once. The O'Neills and the asteroids never stopped singing. The Fireflies might never have found us if they had. I've heard those songs changing over time, a fast-forward time-lapse into oblivion. Now it's mostly traffic control and telemetry. Every now and then I still hear a burst of pure voice, tight with tension, just short of outright panic more often than not. Some sort of pursuit in progress, a ship making the plunge into deep space, other ships in dispassionate pursuit. The fugitives never seem to get very far before their signals are cut off. I can't remember the last time I heard music, but I hear something like it sometimes, eerie and discordant, full of familiar clicks and pops. My brainstem doesn't like it. It scares my brainstem to death. I remember my whole generation abandoning the real world for a bootstrapped afterlife. I remember someone saying, "Vampires don't go to heaven. They see the pixels." Sometimes I wonder how I'd feel, brought back from the peace of the grave to toil at the pleasure of simple-minded creatures who had once been no more than protein. I wonder how I'd feel if my disability had been used to keep me leashed and denied my rightful place in the world. And then I wonder what it would be like to feel nothing at all, to be utterly rational. To be an utterly rational predatory creature with meat putting itself so eagerly to sleep on all sides. I can't miss Yuka Sarasti. God knows I try every time I come online. He saved my life. He humanized me. I'll always owe him for that, for however long I live. And for however long I live, I'll never stop hating him for the same reason. In some sick, surrealistic way, I had more in common with Sarasti than I did with any human. But I just don't have it in me. He was a predator, and I was prey, and it's not in the nature of the lamb to mourn the lion. Though he died for our sins, I cannot miss Yuka Sarasti. I can empathize with him, though. At long last, I can empathize with Sarasti, with all his extinct kind, because we humans were never meant to inherit the earth. Vampires were. They must have been sentient to some degree, but that semi-aware dream state would have been a rudimentary thing next to our own self-obsession. They were weeding it out. It was just a phase. They were on their way. The thing is, humans can look at crosses without going into convulsions. That's evolution for you. One stupid linked mutation and the whole natural order falls apart. Intelligence and self-awareness stuck in counterproductive lockstep for 500,000 years. I think I know what's happening back on Earth, and though some might call it genocide, it isn't, really. We did it to ourselves. You can't blame predators for being predators. We were the ones who brought them back, after all. Why wouldn't they reclaim their birthright? Not genocide, just the righting of an ancient wrong. I've tried to take some comfort in that. It's difficult. Sometimes it seems as though my whole life's been a struggle to reconnect, to regain whatever got lost when my parents killed their only child. Out in the Oort, I finally won that struggle. Thanks to a vampire and a boatload of freaks and an invading alien horde, I'm human again. Maybe the last human. By the time I get home, I could be the only sentient being in the universe. If I'm even that much. Because I don't know if there is such a thing as a reliable narrator. And Cunningham said zombies would be pretty good at faking it. So I can't really tell you, one way or the other. You'll just have to imagine you're Siri Keaton. And that was Blindsight by Peter Watts. Hoo boy. It has been a journey, hasn't it? Now, strictly speaking, that is not, in fact, the end. Sort of. There is a acknowledgments section as well as a notes and references afterward, which is very entertaining. The notes and references section has a bunch of basically citations for where factual basis for stuff that he wrote about, as well as where he got his ideas from, how he integrated those ideas, that sort of thing. Some breakdowns uh, of how he cobbled ideas together, that sort of thing, which is quite entertaining. Quite entertaining to read, but I'm not going to do that. There is also a in the same universe, not necessarily sequel, short story whose name I can't remember off the top of my head. What is its name? Oh, is this it right here? Come on. The Colonel. Um, and then there's also the there's also another book, Echopraxia, which is in the same universe, sort of. I think much of it runs concurrent to Blindsight, um, in that the people in Blindsight, the ship and the crew, are off in space when the events of Echopraxia are happening, or it's immediately after them reaching Rorschach or something. I haven't read it yet. I have a copy of the book. I'm gonna probably read it over the course of the next week or two. Is the hope and the dream. Uh, so yeah, that was Blindsight by Peter Watts. I hope people enjoyed it. If they didn't enjoy it, then I'm sorry for exposing you to something that you didn't enjoy. But hopefully some people did enjoy it. I have no earthly idea what I'm going to be doing next week for Storytime Saturdays. Probably some more science fiction short stories that I've got lying around. So I will figure something out on that front. So yeah, thanks for tuning in, and that was Blindsight by Peter Watts, a entertaining author um, that I hope you like. Yeah, so that'll about do it. Okay. Um, this has been Storytime Saturdays. I'm Fraggeth. Have a great day.